To remain successful in the gaming industry, developers and studios need to embrace change. No matter how consistent a franchise is, consumers will grow tired if it just tosses out the same old, especially if that same old is the bad kind versus however Nintendo get away with the same 3D platformer every generation. Did Josh Brown write this? I joke, of course, but true creators can't be afraid to experiment. Once they do though, us legions of players might rebel, and the only recourse, sometimes after years of trying to convince us of the new direction, is to rip and tear everything down until it is done. I'm Scott from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video games that won by destroying everything. Number 10, Tomb Raider 2013. Tomb Raider was obviously a flagship release on PS1, kickstarting a phenomenally strong franchise that saw Lara Croft appear everywhere from the Lucozade ads of the 90s to a Netflix animation in 2024. Miss Croft is one of the most influential characters in gaming, and yet interest in the badass archaeologist waned surprisingly quickly across the 2000s. Although core design and Crystal Dynamics kept churning out entries, they ranged from average to borderline unplayable. There were hits like the Legend trilogy of Tomb Raider Legend, Anniversary, and Underworld, but you couldn't help but feel like Lara's best days were still behind her. Then came 2013, and Crystal Dynamics turned everything around with a gritty reboot, simply called Tomb Raider. It was more action-oriented, putting a focus on stealth, pacing, precision, and combat, with an all-out survivalist edge that saw a younger, amateurish Lara Croft outnumbered hundreds to one. There was more freedom with gameplay, since open conflict could be avoided, and you'd only make it through with carefully executed headshots, cover spots, and pickaxe takedowns. Lara Croft's past was obviously fueled by her being gaming's first uber-popular sex symbol with a thoroughly sassy demeanor and dry sense of humor. The latter was thoroughly fleshed out, rounding out the appeal of the character with a story and set of circumstances fans were glad to experience. Number 9, Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time. After the success of the first 3 Crash Bandicoot games and the almighty Crash Team Racing, nobody would have blamed Naughty Dog if they threw out a couple more sequels in rapid succession. Instead, the company took on different projects, encouraging other developers to step in and devise all sorts of spin-offs. The divisive Wrath of Cortex from Traveler's Tales splits generations of gamers, like whether Tony Hawk's 2 or 3 is the absolute king, but Crash's kart racing title still went down a storm. Over enough years though, Crash Bash, Twinsanity, Mind Over Mutant, and Crash Boom Bang proved the bad had outweighed the good. And when the Insane Trilogy remake sold well, it was clear the forever passionate Crash fanbase wanted another pure adventure. Luckily, and to this day, I treasure this game. After a grueling 22-year wait, we finally got Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time. A gorgeous, perfectly playing title with new mask-based powers and some of the best levels in Crash history. Crash 4 was that true continuation fans had been clamoring for that picked up right where Crash 3 Warped left off. Painfully, as an addendum to all this, Crash 5 was cancelled to make way for the disastrous live service title Crash Team Rumble, putting the Bandicoot back on ice for now, but at least the path forward is clearer than ever if Activision ever get their priorities straight again. Number 8, Donkey Kong Country Returns. DK dominated platforming during the SNES days, second only to Super Mario. However, things went south when the ape took to the third dimension. Donkey Kong 64 is arguably responsible for the decline of collectathon platformers. Donkey Konga was a literal barrel of fun, but the rhythm-based spin-offs couldn't match Donkey Kong in his prime. Worst of all, the prospect of another platformer involving the Kremling-bashing Kong seemed unlikely when Donkey Kong Country's developers Rare ended their partnership with Nintendo in 2002. That's why it was a surprise when Retro Studios' Donkey Kong Country Returns barrel blasted onto the Wii in 2010. Released 14 years after the last entry, this sequel had a ton to live up to. Thankfully, Returns was a fitting return to form and a reminder of what fans were asking for. The long-awaited sequel's platforming, level design, and music stayed true to the original, even bringing in motion controls, which Nintendo were convinced could be applied to anything other than Wii Sports. The main campaign was too hard for some, but that's pretty on brand for a Donkey Kong Country game, especially if you go back and play the beloved SNES one today. Number 7, Mortal Kombat 2011. Mortal Kombat's digitized scans of actors, its distinctive roster, and chunky combat made for an immediate impression on the gaming industry in the early 90s. Yes, the games were profiled alongside the likes of Doom and Grand Theft Auto as poisoning the youth, but NetherRealm went from strength to strength, charting a course from 2D to 3D to HD that's simply legend in retrospect. All that said, Mortal Kombat vets like myself remember the mid-2000s era being a bit inconsistent, with 5th main installment Deception having a phenomenal conquest campaign campaign mode, but as a package solidifying the worst aspects of Deadly Alliance, and bringing in a feeling that lore and roster choices were getting a bit too convoluted for their own good. With MK Armageddon feeling like a repackage of old assets with a thoroughly disappointing fatality system alongside, and MK vs DC Universe toning down the violence, Mortal Kombat fans were deservedly pretty pissed. Their once unstoppable brand had become a mess and was in desperate need of a reset. Thankfully, Warner Bros. Stepped in when publisher Midway went under, seeing NetherRealm Studios release a retcon of the first 3 games as just Mortal Kombat in 2011, maintaining the same timeline overall and putting the spotlight back on a solid roster, cinematic special moves, and blistering combos. With a revolutionary approach to storytelling so effective it's seen Tekken and Street Fighter follow suit, this mashup of cutscenes and combat was an incredibly confident announcement to the world that 2011's Mortal Kombat was for new and returning fans alike. Mortal Kombat is bigger than ever today, precisely because of what NetherRealm pulled off when all seemed lost. Number 6. Castlevania: Circle of the Moon. Symphony of the Night isn't just considered Castlevania at its best, but one of the greatest video games ever made. It had the same side-scrolling structure as its predecessors, but placed a heavier emphasis on exploration, puzzles, and little piles of secrets. With Castlevania's popularity at an all-time high after Symphony's release, it would have made sense for Konami to keep going with what most of the world was now falling in love with. However, with many 2D games at the time switching to 3D, Konami followed suit, leading to Castlevania 64. Sadly, the action-adventure reimagining was bland, imprecise, and just dull. It was followed by a supposedly improved version called Legacy of Darkness, which was then somehow even worse. Due to all the negative feedback, Konami reverted to 2D for the next installment, Circle of the Moon. And when this Game Boy Advance title received universal praise, Konami made the wise decision to stick with the old school formula once again, releasing half a dozen follow-ups that maintained the Metroidvania structure and gameplay. Castlevania has gone back to 3D several times since, with mixed results. The Lords of Shadow titles certainly have their fans, but all evidence shows Castlevania works better when it keeps to tradition. Symphony of the Night may be the zenith of the series to this day, but it was Circle of the Moon that made Konami realize their own side-scrolling approach was still the way forward. Number 5. Devil May Cry 5. In retrospect, Devil May Cry had one hell of a journey across its initial run. First touted as the next big name to look out for, then crippled by a sequel that had a very messy development. A third installment that righted the ship, only for DMC4 to play supremely well but suffer a ton of backtracking, and a near doppelganger protagonist people just could not make their minds up on. As a result, Capcom gave the series to Ninja Theory, hoping a full reboot would be seen as a welcome change. Ironically, this did unite the fanbase, but entirely against what was shown, with most people hating the formerly wisecracking Dante, now a mopey and broody antihero. 2013's DMC Devil May Cry was a critical success and it's well worth playing today, but its sales were disastrous. As such, DMC was taken back to formula while we waited 6 agonizing years to see if the franchise was even still alive. Thankfully, 2019 saw DMC 5 continue where 4 left off, bringing back over-the-top action and cheesy characters with a killer soundtrack and overall sense of cinematic flair and gameplay possibilities, taking the whole formula to the next level. Capcom even made character Nero work better than ever before, producing arguably the best all-round DMC package yet, and one that's now the best-selling entry in the whole series. Number 4. Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. Few games rebuild themselves as literally as Final Fantasy XIV. Thanks to performance issues, a shoddy UI, atrocious combat, and a focus on pure grinding, this initially unfinished travesty of a release barely clawed its way to 49% on Metacritic in 2010. Turns out the game had been in the works since 2005, and due to Final Fantasy XIV's sorry launch state, a handful of patches wasn't going to be enough to reverse the damage. A total overhaul was a drastic idea, but Square Enix had little choice, since their reputation was now on the line. New director Naoki Yoshida got to work putting out the many fires of 14 day to day and started assembling an entirely new version of the game. With a more powerful engine and considerably renovated graphics, narrative, and server stability, Final Fantasy XIV was shut down nearly 3 years after release, only to be replaced entirely with the now fitting title of A Realm Reborn. Virtually every aspect was improved, seeing floods of almost 30 million players getting involved to this day. Yoshida went on to helm the mighty Final Fantasy XVI almost as a reward for doing such miraculous work, with FF14 having a phenomenal run of expansions, truly saving something once thought of as unsalvageable. Number 3. Sonic Mania. It should actually be studied how meteoric the return of Sonic the Hedgehog has been in the modern day. Literally no one ever, scientist, no palm-reading expert, would have called that one of the rockiest IPs in gaming history would see its character not only go on to have an even bigger mainstream success than his initial period across the 90s, but that there'd be a successful film trilogy and that Keanu Reeves would voice Shadow the Hedgehog. Anyway, if we're looking at where the momentum started to shift, pre-weird movie design Sonic, it was with Sonic Mania, the immaculate repackage of the original title's feel, helmed masterfully by fan modder Christian Whitehead and his team at Headcanon. As Sega threw up their hands and screamed, "We do not know what we're doing," Mania was the best installment since the Mega Drive days, nailing the gameplay, look, and chiptune soundtrack of the classics with a production and immediacy that brought them into the modern day. Headcanon remixed elements from Sonic Rush, Sonic Colors, and even Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine for a specific boss fight, proving to the bigwigs that this style was always what made Sonic work. Number 2, Doom 2016. Doom 3 is by no means a bad game, but it is a bad Doom game. The first 2 monumental releases are known for letting you blast everything in sight at a pace no one else was getting anywhere near, especially considering those now iconic soundtracks and weapons like the BFG. For Doom 3, id Software went in the opposite direction, favoring atmosphere, subtlety, and story. These elements are all well and good, but Doom was founded on obliteration, reducing every imp, pinky, and arachnotron to a bloody smear on the wall. As a result, Doom 3 largely shelved the IP, with the original version of Doom 4 also being scrapped during development, replaced with the anarchic rip and tear until it's done of 2016's soft reboot just called Doom. Following the original's blueprint from the jump, combat was next level relentless, not even requiring weapons to reload and giving you awesome gory kill finishes for waves of demons that never stopped coming. Doom Eternal would then take all these ideas and run with them, setting the stage perfectly for Doom the Dark Ages in 2025. And number 1, Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 4 was an absolute triumph, but it showed Capcom that a wider audience for zombie horror may favor full-blown action over atmospheric scares. They would then double down for RE5, replacing all potential suspense with over-the-top gunplay. And though Resident Evil 6 devoted a portion of its campaign to survival horror again, it was so watered down and scattered overall that the game itself barely resembled Resident Evil. Capcom took a minute, or a half decade's worth like they were also doing with Devil May Cry, and came back swinging. To undo the damage, RE7 reimagined everything from the ground up, both being called RE7 Biohazard as a callback to the original name in Japan and changing to a first-person perspective, as another nod to Sweet Home, the game that inspired Resident Evil in the first place. Slow build tension and genuine scares were back front and center, with characterization and environmental exploration now major factors once again. Rather than having a whole village or city to explore, the game was scaled back to essentially one house, emulating the claustrophobia of RE1's Spencer Mansion. Capcom would go on to split off a string of remakes that walk a perfect line between old and new, but it was Resident Evil 7 that flawlessly recreated the dread gamers felt playing the original game.